April 1943. Over the gray skies of occupied France, German pilots spotted a new intruder. At first glance, it looked absurd, an American fighter so massive it seemed more like a flying beer keg than a machine built for combat. The Luftwaffe laughed. Pilots mocked it as a milk jug with wings, convinced it could never match the nimble Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs that had ruled Europe's airspace. But war has a way of turning laughter into silence. The aircraft was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a machine unlike anything the world had seen. It weighed in at over 7 tons fully loaded, with an engine so powerful it could shake the ground during takeoff. To German aces used to dueling in sleek, elegant fighters, the Thunderbolt was a joke waiting to be written into the history books. Yet within months, that joke became a nightmare. Picture this. You are a German infantryman marching through the fields of Normandy in the summer of 1944. Suddenly, a low rumble builds in the distance, like a thunderstorm rolling across the sky. You look up, and there it is. A formation of P-47s swoops down, sunlight glinting off their silver fuselages. Then the sky erupts. Each Thunderbolt unleashes 8.50 caliber machine guns, firing streams of lead so dense they seem to carve the air itself. Trucks explode in fireballs, tanks erupt under rocket strikes, and soldiers scatter in panic as the ground shakes from bomb blasts. The laughter of the Luftwaffe was gone, replaced by fear. What made the P-47 so extraordinary was not grace, but brute force. With firepower that dwarfed anything in its class, it could shred trains, convoys, and even heavily armored panzer divisions. And when German fighters tried to intercept, they discovered something else. The jug, as American pilots fondly called it, was nearly indestructible. Stories spread of Thunderbolts limping home with engines shot out, wings shredded, even entire control surfaces missing, yet somehow still managing to land. One American ace described it simply: the jug was a tank with wings. You could throw it into hell, and it would drag you back out again. In this documentary, we'll dive deep into the saga of the Thunderbolt. You'll hear how German pilots initially dismissed it, how American engineers designed one of the most rugged fighters of the war, and how its devastating firepower reshaped the battlefields of Europe. From dogfights over France to deadly strafing runs across Germany, we'll explore how the jug became the unsung hero of the skies. If you're fascinated by untold World War II stories, if you want to feel the roar of a 2,000 horsepower engine and the rattle of 8 heavy machine guns tearing through history, then stay with us. Subscribe now, because this is only the beginning. The Thunderbolt story is a thunderclap across the past, and once you've heard it, you'll never forget the sound. The P-47 Thunderbolt was born not from elegance, but from desperation. By 1940, war in Europe was raging, and America's military leaders knew they were behind. The Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s were dominating the skies. Britain, battered and bloodied from the Battle of Britain, was holding on by a thread. If America was to join the war, it needed a fighter, fast, durable, and capable of escorting bombers deep into hostile territory. The Republic Aviation Company, led by the brilliant but pragmatic engineer Alexander Kartveli, was tasked with building something new. At first, the design was modest, a lightweight fighter to compete with nimble European machines. But the realities of modern combat soon forced a rethink. Kartveli recognized that to survive against German firepower, a fighter would need more than agility. It would need power, protection, and above all, firepower. The result was the P-47 Thunderbolt, an aircraft that broke nearly every convention of fighter design. Where other fighters were sleek and slender, the Thunderbolt was massive. With its Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp radial engine, the most powerful piston engine available, it required a hulking fuselage to house it. Fully loaded, the P-47 weighed over 14,000 pounds, making it one of the heaviest single-engine fighters of the war. To many, it looked ridiculous. German intelligence reports sneered at the design, calling it too heavy, too slow, too cumbersome. Even within the U.S. Army Air Forces, eyebrows were raised. Could such a beast ever compete with the nimble Bf-109s and Fw-190s that danced through Europe's skies? Pilots themselves were skeptical. The Thunderbolt dwarfed the P-51 Mustang and the British Spitfire. It seemed less like a fighter and more like a bomber pretending to be agile. And the problems were real. Early models of the P-47 struggled with range. It could not escort bombers on deep strikes into Germany, a role desperately needed in 1942 and 1943. Its size made it slow to climb, and in tight dogfights, Luftwaffe aces quickly learned how to exploit its bulk. For American bomber crews flying unescorted raids over the Reich, salvation from the Jug often came too late. Yet, while critics laughed, something remarkable was happening. The Thunderbolt was proving itself nearly indestructible. Reports began to circulate of P-47s absorbing staggering damage and still making it home. One squadron in England counted a Jug returning with half its tail shot away, another with cylinders missing from its engine, yet both landed safely. German pilots who had mocked its bulk found themselves frustrated as cannon shells seemed to vanish into the Jug's armored frame. The real problem, however, lay in perception. The Thunderbolt was not meant to be a duelist's blade, like the Spitfire or the Messerschmitt. It was a hammer. With 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, it could unleash a torrent of fire unmatched by any other Allied fighter. In strafing runs against trains, trucks, and tanks, its weight and firepower became assets rather than liabilities. But convincing both pilots and commanders of this took time. An American pilot stationed in England in 1943 captured the sentiment in his journal. The Jug feels like flying a barn door. She's heavy, clumsy, and slow to climb. But when those guns fire, my God, the sky turns white with tracers. I'd hate to be on the ground when we come through. That was the Thunderbolt's paradox. It was mocked by friend and foe alike, yet within a year, it would earn a reputation as one of the most feared fighters in Europe. German pilots, who once laughed at its size, would come to dread the thunder of its guns. The problem was not just technical but cultural. Fighter pilots craved speed and agility, the romance of dogfights in the clouds. The P-47 offered something different: brute survival and overwhelming firepower. It was not glamorous. It was not elegant. But as the war dragged on and losses mounted, the Allies would discover that brute force often wins wars where elegance fails. By mid-1943, the Thunderbolt faced its trial by fire. Deployed across Europe with the 8th Air Force, it was tasked with defending bombers and attacking ground targets in occupied France. At first, it struggled to adapt. But slowly, through trial and error, pilots learned to use its strengths: dive speed, ruggedness, and sheer destructive power. What began as a problem aircraft was about to become a nightmare for the Reich. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a paradox. Mocked for its bulk and derided as ungainly, yet destined to become one of the most formidable fighters of World War II. Its story lies not in elegance but in engineering, how brute power, rugged construction, and overwhelming firepower forged a machine that terrified enemies and saved countless lives. At the heart of the Thunderbolt's identity was its engine, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp. This 18-cylinder radial powerhouse delivered over 2,000 horsepower, making it one of the most powerful piston engines of the war. To house it, engineers built a fuselage that looked more like a flying barrel than a fighter plane. Fully loaded, the P-47 tipped the scales at over 14,000 pounds, nearly twice the weight of the nimble Spitfire. For pilots used to light, twitchy aircraft, the Jug, as it was affectionately called, felt like strapping into a flying tank. But that weight carried hidden advantages. The massive engine allowed the P-47 to dive faster than almost any other aircraft of the war. German pilots learned quickly that chasing a Thunderbolt in a dive was suicide. Its sheer mass carried it downward like a falling anvil, reaching speeds above 500 miles per hour. At those speeds, Luftwaffe fighters risked ripping their wings apart if they tried to follow. This gave American pilots a lifeline. If outmaneuvered, they could simply dive away, regroup, and strike again. Its armament was equally imposing. The Thunderbolt mounted 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 in each wing. Together, they could spit out more than 13 pounds of lead per second. To put that in perspective, a short burst from a P-47 could shred a locomotive, rip through armored vehicles, or disintegrate enemy aircraft caught in its path. German pilots who had once joked about the Jug soon discovered that one head-on pass against its guns was enough to turn laughter into terror. On the ground, the effect was devastating. As the Allies advanced through France and into Germany, the Thunderbolt evolved into the hammer of close air support. With bombs, rockets, and its fearsome machine guns, it became the scourge of German armor. Reports from Normandy in the summer of 1944 describe entire panzer columns reduced to twisted wreckage under P-47 attacks. A single squadron could leave highways littered with burned-out tanks, smashed trucks, and shattered artillery. Pilots often spoke of the satisfaction and horror of these missions. One recalled, "We flew low over the hedgerows. You could see the Germans diving for cover. Then the tracers lit the ground like welding torches, and everything exploded. It was destruction on a scale I had never imagined." Critics had argued that the P-47 was too heavy, too slow to climb, and too ungainly for real air combat. But those criticisms ignored what it offered in return: survivability. The Jug's rugged airframe and radial engine could soak up punishment that would doom most fighters. Stories abound of Thunderbolts returning with holes the size of doors in their wings, cylinders blown off the engine, or entire control surfaces missing, yet still limping home. One after-action report from 1944 tells of a P-47 that flew more than 200 miles back to base with one wing nearly shredded and oil streaming from its crippled engine. The pilot landed safely, stepped out shaken but alive. The aircraft itself was later patched and returned to service. German fighters like the Bf-109, elegant but fragile, could rarely boast such resilience. The Thunderbolt's technical philosophy was simple: survive first, kill second. Its designers knew that in a war of attrition, bringing pilots home mattered as much as destroying the enemy. By combining armor, power, and devastating firepower, the P-47 created a new kind of fighter, one that did not win battles with agility but with sheer dominance. To fully understand the Thunderbolt's place in history, we have to compare it with its peers. On the Allied side, the Spitfire and the P-51 Mustang embodied grace and agility. On the Axis side, the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf Fw-190 were legendary predators. Against this company, the Thunderbolt seemed out of place, until numbers told the real story. Take the Spitfire, elegant, nimble, beloved by its pilots. But the Spitfire had limited range, unable to escort bombers deep into Germany. The Mustang, with its long legs and laminar flow wing, eventually became the escort of choice. Yet both aircraft were relatively fragile. A burst of cannon fire from a German fighter could bring them down. The P-47, by contrast, was a survivor. Its radial engine was less vulnerable than the liquid-cooled engines of the Mustang and Spitfire. A single bullet to a radiator could doom those aircraft. The Jug could take far worse and keep flying. Against the Bf-109, the Thunderbolt was no dancer. The Messerschmitt could outturn it at low speeds, climbing rapidly to seize the advantage. But in a dive, the P-47 was untouchable. German pilots soon learned that pursuing a Jug downward was a fatal error. Even the Fw-190, with its formidable firepower, found itself disadvantaged against the Thunderbolt's toughness and raw dive speed. Pilots described the Jug as unstoppable in a dive, like chasing a falling anvil. And then there was firepower. The Bf-109 often carried 2 machine guns and a single cannon. The Fw-190 bristled with 4 cannons, but at the cost of weight and maneuverability. The P-51 Mustang carried 6.50 caliber Brownings. But the Jug's 8 heavy machine guns set it apart. In practice, this meant that when a P-47 opened fire, it didn't just attack, it obliterated. German pilots unlucky enough to face its guns often found their aircraft shredded before they could react. The destructive potential wasn't limited to air combat. With racks for bombs and later rockets, the Thunderbolt became the backbone of Allied close air support. In Normandy, in the Ardennes, and across the Rhine, it was the Jug that pounded German tanks and trucks. Combat footage and after-action reports show P-47s strafing rail yards, blowing locomotives apart in showers of sparks, or reducing entire convoys to burning wreckage. This dual role, as both fighter and ground attack aircraft, made it indispensable. Statistically, the Jug proved its worth. By the end of the war, P-47s had destroyed over 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. They claimed nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft in the air and countless more on the ground. Pilots flying the Thunderbolt often said their missions felt less like duels and more like industrial demolition. The cost of this effectiveness was weight. The P-47 consumed fuel voraciously, limiting its range until external drop tanks became standard. It also required long runways and could be sluggish at altitude compared to the Mustang. But these shortcomings only reinforced the point. The Jug was never meant to be a duelist. It was designed to smash, to endure, to dominate by sheer force. One German ace, interviewed after the war, admitted, "We laughed at it when it arrived. It was too big, too heavy, too slow. But soon, when we saw what its guns did to our columns, no one laughed. We feared the Thunderbolt more than the fortress." That is perhaps the best summary of the Jug's technical legacy. It was a fighter that defied expectations, turning perceived weaknesses into strengths. Where others sought elegance, it delivered brute survival. Where others prized agility, it unleashed firepower. Where others were fragile, it was indestructible. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not the prettiest or the most famous fighter of World War II. But for the men who flew it, and the enemies who faced it, it was unforgettable. Its engineering embodied a philosophy that was as American as the factories that built it: bigger, tougher, stronger. And in war, that philosophy proved devastating. The first real proving ground for the P-47 Thunderbolt came in 1943, when American fighter groups arrived in Britain under the command of the 8th Air Force. At that time, the U.S. Army Air Forces were engaged in a deadly gamble: daylight strategic bombing over Germany. Unlike the British, who struck at night, Americans believed in precision raids by day. But without fighter escort, their bombers were suffering catastrophic losses. The P-47, massive and untested in European combat, was thrown into this cauldron. German pilots in their sleek Bf-109s and Fw-190s initially mocked the new arrival. To them, the Jug was far too large and sluggish to compete. But when they met it in combat, the laughter quickly died. In April 1943, the Thunderbolt flew its first combat missions over France. Early encounters were cautious, as pilots tested the Jug against seasoned Luftwaffe veterans. The Germans were surprised by its dive speed. When pressed, the Jug could simply nosedive away, leaving pursuers unable to follow without tearing their wings apart. A Luftwaffe after-action report noted with frustration, "The new American fighter is ungainly, but impossible to catch in a dive. It can absorb many hits and still fight." At first, range was a problem. The P-47 could not yet escort bombers deep into Germany, limiting its usefulness. Raids on Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Bremen often saw bombers flying beyond fighter cover, with devastating results. Pilots cursed the Jug's short legs. But engineers responded with external drop tanks, extending its reach. By late 1943, Thunderbolts were escorting bombers deeper and deeper into the Reich, and German pilots could no longer count on unprotected prey. One pilot from the 56 Fighter Group, the famed Zemke's Wolf Pack, described the change. "At first, we were tied to the channel, watching our bombers disappear into hell. Once we had tanks, the game flipped. We could go with them, fight for them, and bring them home. That's when the Jug came alive." It was during these long-range missions that the Thunderbolt's durability became legendary. Bomber crews often watched in awe as P-47s fought off swarms of German fighters, sometimes returning home with wings shredded or engines trailing smoke. In one case, a Jug landed in England with over 200 bullet holes, yet the pilot walked away unharmed. Stories like these spread rapidly, reshaping the aircraft's reputation from clumsy brute to indestructible guardian. By late 1943, Thunderbolt groups were claiming hundreds of Luftwaffe kills. The Wolfpack alone destroyed more than 500 enemy aircraft during the war, many in these early months. For the Luftwaffe, the Jug was no longer a curiosity, it was a threat. German pilots began to respect its firepower, learning to avoid head-on confrontations with its 8.50 caliber guns. Yet the Jug's greatest evolution came not in the air but on the ground. As Allied planning for Operation Overlord accelerated in 1944, the Thunderbolt found its true calling, ground attack. With pylons for bombs and rockets added under its wings, the Jug became a flying artillery piece. In early 1944, P-47 groups began attacking rail lines across France. The goal was clear: sever German logistics before the invasion. Pilots strafed locomotives, blasted bridges, and left supply trains burning across the countryside. A German railway worker later recalled, "We could not move anything by day. The Thunderbolts came in screaming, guns flashing, and the rails would vanish in fire." The effect was strategic. By the time Allied troops stormed Normandy, German reinforcements were crippled by the destruction of their transport networks. The Jug, once ridiculed, was now a key weapon in shaping the battlefield. But this transformation came at a price. Ground attack missions were brutally dangerous. Flak batteries lined rail yards and road junctions, and low-level strafing left pilots vulnerable to small arms fire. Casualties mounted. Yet the Jug's toughness saved many who would have perished in lighter aircraft. Pilots often returned shaken, with shattered canopies or scorched engines, but alive. The first phase of the Jug's war had proven two things: it could duel with the Luftwaffe when forced, and it could devastate German logistics from the air. By the spring of 1944, the Jug was no longer a laughingstock. It was a storm on the horizon, one that would break fully over Normandy in June. June 6, 1944. The greatest armada in history crossed the English Channel, carrying the fate of Europe on its decks. Above that armada, the sky thundered with aircraft, bombers, transports, fighters. Among them, the P-47 Thunderbolt played a role that would cement its place as one of the decisive weapons of the war. In the hours before the landings, Thunderbolts struck deep into German defenses. Bridges were bombed, rail junctions shattered, and coastal batteries strafed with relentless fire. While heavy bombers pounded targets inland, it was the Jug that flew low, braving flak to suppress enemy strongpoints near the beaches. Its 8.50 caliber guns raked bunkers, machine gun nests, and convoys racing to reinforce the coast. Soldiers on Utah Beach later testified that the sight of P-47s diving on German positions saved countless lives. One infantryman recalled, "The Jugs came roaring over us, guns blazing. The German fire slackened, and we surged forward. Without them, we would have been pinned down on the sand." In the days that followed, Normandy became a proving ground for the Jug's role as a ground attack specialist. German armor tried desperately to counterattack the fragile beachhead. Panzer divisions rolled toward the front, confident in their steel. But the Thunderbolts hunted them mercilessly. Flying in pairs or squadrons, Jug swooped down, unleashing rockets and bombs, then finishing with strafing runs that turned tanks into flaming wrecks. The Germans soon gave the Jug a new name, Der Bulldozer der Luft, the bulldozer of the skies. It was not elegant, but it was unstoppable. Where panzers advanced, Thunderbolts descended, and the results were devastating. One mission near St. Lo illustrates the point. A formation of P-47s caught a German armored column moving along a hedgerow-lined road. Within minutes, the road became an inferno of twisted steel. Tanks smoldered, half-tracks exploded, and the survivors scattered in terror. American ground troops advancing behind later found the wreckage still burning, the air reeking of fuel and scorched metal. The effectiveness of the Jug was multiplied by its survivability. Pilots engaged in these low-level attacks faced walls of flak and small arms fire. Yet time and again, Thunderbolts came home with holes peppering their fuselages, sometimes with cylinders blown clean off the engine, and still landed safely. Stories spread of Jugs flying back on a single aileron or limping across the channel with smoke trailing like a comet. Each tale reinforced the fighter's reputation as indestructible. But the cost was high. In June and July 1944, casualty rates among Thunderbolt squadrons soared. Pilots were asked to fly multiple sorties a day, often at treetop level, into zones thick with German defenses. For many, the cockpit became a coffin waiting to close. Squadron diaries speak of empty bunks and mess tables, of comrades who vanished into smoke and flame. Still, the results were undeniable. By July, German supply lines in Normandy were collapsing. Trains no longer ran by day. Convoys moved only under cover of night. Bridges were so often destroyed that German engineers joked bitterly they were now bridge builders instead of soldiers. One captured officer admitted, "It was not the big bombers that broke us in Normandy. It was the jugs. They killed our transport, our tanks, our courage." As the Allies pushed inland, the Thunderbolt followed, its missions expanding to include close support of infantry. Pilots coordinated with ground commanders, striking targets sometimes only hundreds of yards ahead of friendly troops. It was dangerous work, requiring precision and nerves of steel, but it made the jug beloved by soldiers. Infantrymen scrawled, "Thank God for the jugs," on walls and helmets, knowing that when the Thunderbolts roared overhead, survival was more likely. The Normandy campaign proved a turning point not only in the war but in the jug's reputation. What had once been mocked as too heavy, too slow, and too clumsy was now hailed as indispensable. German pilots no longer laughed when they saw the Thunderbolt. They dove for cover or fought desperately to avoid its guns. By August 1944, as Allied forces broke out of the bocage and surged toward Paris, the jug had become the hammer of the advance. Bridges fell, roads choked with wreckage, and the Luftwaffe, once masters of the skies, could barely contest the Thunderbolt's dominance. The laughter of 1943 was gone, buried beneath the thunder of 8 guns and the wreckage of 1,000 burning tanks. By late summer 1944, the Allies had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. Patton's Third Army surged forward, fueled by speed and momentum. But rapid advances stretched supply lines thin, and every German counterattack threatened to stall the offensive. In this desperate, fast-moving war of maneuver, the P-47 Thunderbolt became the hammer that kept the Allies moving. Operating from hastily built airstrips in Normandy and later central France, Thunderbolt squadrons flew dozens of sorties a day. Their targets were anything that moved behind German lines: convoys, fuel depots, trains, and columns of retreating troops. Pilots often joked grimly that if it had wheels, the jug would burn it. One famous mission came during the Falaise Pocket in August 1944. As German forces tried to escape encirclement, Thunderbolts pounced. For days, they strafed and bombed the congested roads, turning the escape route into what survivors called the corridor of death. Eyewitnesses described the aftermath as apocalyptic: mile after mile of shattered vehicles, bloated horses, and blackened corpses. The Luftwaffe tried to intervene, but by this point, Allied air superiority was overwhelming. German troops, once confident in their panzers, now feared every shadow in the sky. The effect on morale was catastrophic. A German infantry officer captured after Falaise admitted, "It was not the artillery that broke us. It was the fighter bombers. They hunted us everywhere, like wolves." Yet as autumn turned to winter, the war entered a new, brutal phase. In December 1944, Hitler launched his last great gamble, the Ardennes Offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Under cover of snow and cloud, German tanks and infantry smashed through the thin American lines, driving deep into Belgium. At first, the weather grounded Allied aircraft, leaving ground troops to face the onslaught alone. Without their guardian angels in the sky, American units were pushed back, surrounded, and nearly destroyed. But when the skies cleared, the Thunderbolts returned with vengeance. On December 23, the weather broke, and P-47 squadrons poured into the battle zone. They attacked supply convoys, fuel dumps, and armored spearheads with merciless precision. The Luftwaffe tried to contest the skies, but by this stage of the war, its strength was a shadow of its former self. German pilots who engaged the jug found themselves outgunned and outnumbered, their laughter from 1943 now bitter silence. The jug's role in halting the Ardennes offensive cannot be overstated. German tanks advanced boldly, but without fuel, they were helpless. Thunderbolts made sure of that. Over the course of the battle, they destroyed thousands of vehicles, leaving smoldering wreckage clogging the snowy forests and roads. American soldiers on the ground spoke with awe of the low-flying jugs screaming through the valleys, rockets hissing, bombs crashing, and machine guns tearing into the enemy. One GI in Bastogne wrote in his diary, "We thought we were done for. Then the sky opened, and the jugs came. They saved us." The Germans, too, recognized the turning point. Field reports complained that every attempt to move supplies by day ended in disaster. Fuel trucks, especially, were priority targets, and P-47 pilots became masters at spotting and igniting them with a single burst of gunfire. Without fuel, the mighty Tiger tanks of the Wehrmacht became little more than steel coffins. By January 1945, the offensive had collapsed. Hitler's last gamble had failed, and the road to Germany lay open. While infantry and armor held the line on the ground, it was the relentless pounding from the air, much of it delivered by Thunderbolts, that ensured the German army could not sustain its advance. For American pilots, the Ardennes was a vindication. The Jug, once mocked as too heavy, had proven to be the perfect winter predator. Its ruggedness allowed it to shrug off flak hits and keep flying in freezing conditions. Its heavy armament made short work of tanks and trucks alike, and its presence gave hope to embattled troops who looked skyward for salvation. By the start of 1945, there was no longer any question of the P-47's value. It had become more than just a fighter. It was the backbone of Allied tactical air power. From Normandy to the Ardennes, it had shown that brute force, survivability, and overwhelming firepower could shape battles as decisively as strategy on the ground. By February 1945, the Reich was collapsing. Soviet armies closed in from the east, and the Western Allies prepared to cross the Rhine into Germany itself. For the Wehrmacht, every mile of retreat was contested, every road clogged with vehicles, refugees, and remnants of shattered units. And above it all, the roar of the P-47 Thunderbolt became the soundtrack of Germany's destruction. The Jug by now had fully evolved into a fighter-bomber of devastating efficiency. With rockets slung under its wings, bombs in its racks, and 8.50 caliber guns loaded, it could carry out a mission profile almost identical to that of a light bomber, yet still retain the ability to duel in the skies if challenged. It was, in every sense, the ultimate multi-role weapon of the war's final act. In March 1945, as Allied forces prepared for the critical Rhine crossing, Thunderbolts flew round-the-clock missions. They blasted bridges, strafed ferries, and shredded any German unit attempting to regroup on the river's far bank. Infantrymen who waded into boats under fire prayed for air cover, and the Jug delivered. German soldiers later described the crossing as hopeless. Every time a column tried to form, Thunderbolts descended, unleashing fire that reduced men and machines to wreckage within minutes. The destruction was systematic. Railway junctions in the Ruhr industrial heartland were smashed day after day, preventing reinforcements from reaching the front. Convoys moving fuel and ammunition were annihilated. By April, Germany's war machine was starving, not just for resources, but for mobility. The Luftwaffe could do little. Its numbers had been bled dry, its aces either killed or grounded for lack of fuel. The few fighters that rose to challenge the Jugs were cut down by swarms of Allied aircraft. One German mechanic captured near the Ruhr summed it up bitterly: "We had tanks, but they could not move. We had guns, but no shells arrived. We had orders, but no roads left." The Thunderbolts destroyed everything. For American pilots, the final weeks were both triumphant and grim. Missions became hunting expeditions, scouring the countryside for trains, trucks, or anything that moved. The destruction was relentless. After-action reports list hundreds of sorties ending with burning locomotives, shattered vehicles, and convoys reduced to twisted scrap. Yet pilots also wrote of unease, of seeing civilians among the chaos, of realizing that their firepower was laying waste not just to armies but to a nation in its death throes. Still, the Jug remained beloved by the soldiers it supported. When the U.S. Army crossed the Rhine, infantry and armor knew that the Thunderbolt would be overhead, striking fear into any German counterattack. GI graffiti on ruined walls sometimes simply read, "The Jugs were here." For weary men on the ground, that was reassurance enough. By May 1945, the war in Europe ended. The Luftwaffe was destroyed, the Reich in ruins. In the tallies of victory, the P-47 had written an astonishing record, More than 86,000 railway cars destroyed, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and nearly 70,000 trucks. In the air, Thunderbolts claimed close to 4,000 enemy aircraft. No other fighter combined such ferocious ground attack results with sustained air combat success. And yet, the Jug's legacy was paradoxical. It had been mocked by German pilots in 1943, feared by them in 1944, and by 1945, it was the executioner of Germany's infrastructure. But in the post-war years, the P-51 Mustang, with its sleek lines and long-range escort record, captured the imagination of history. The Thunderbolt, despite its unmatched ground attack record, faded into the background. Veterans remembered it as the Jug that saved our lives, but public memory often overlooked it. Still, for those who were there, in the cockpits, in the tanks it destroyed, or in the foxholes it saved, the P-47 was unforgettable. It was the hammer that smashed the Reich's last defenses, the anvil that endured German fire, and the thunder that rolled across Europe until silence fell in May 1945. One pilot, reflecting decades later, put it simply, the Jug wasn't pretty. It wasn't graceful. But when you strapped in, you knew it would get you home. And that was its greatest weapon. Every war machine is judged not in isolation but against its rivals and its peers. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt is inseparable from the aircraft that flew alongside it and those it fought against. And in these comparisons, the mistakes in perception, both Allied and Axis, become strikingly clear. At first glance, the Thunderbolt could hardly have looked more different from the fighters it accompanied in Allied service. The British Spitfire, elegant and slim, was the darling of aerial combat. The American P-51 Mustang, with its sleek lines and long range, became the escort fighter of legend. By comparison, the P-47 looked bloated, even grotesque. Its thick fuselage, broad wings, and massive engine cowling seemed the very opposite of aerodynamic elegance. Many American pilots fresh from flight school looked at the Jug and felt disappointment. They wanted the sports car of the skies, not the bulldozer. And yet, appearances deceived. The Spitfire was exquisite in dogfights but short-legged. It could not accompany bombers over Germany. The Mustang could, its range carried it deep into the Reich, but its liquid-cooled Merlin engine was vulnerable. A single cannon shell to the radiator meant almost certain death. The Jug, with its radial engine and armor plating, could survive damage that would doom its peers. Pilots joked that you could pour sand into the engine and it would still fly. This resilience made it the aircraft of choice for ground attack, where danger was constant and survival paramount. Against its enemies, the comparisons were just as stark. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was nimble, fast climbing, and deadly in the hands of an ace. The Focke-Wulf FW 190 was rugged, heavily armed, and respected by Allied pilots. Both had drawn blood over Europe for years before the Thunderbolt arrived. German pilots saw the Jug and assumed it could never keep pace. In turning duels, they were often right. The Bf 109 could outturn a Jug at low speeds. But war is not fought on one axis alone. In a dive, the Thunderbolt was unmatched, able to plummet like a stone at speeds that would rip the wings off a Messerschmitt. German pilots who underestimated this often paid with their lives. The greatest misjudgment, however, lay in underestimating the Jug's firepower. 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns were not simply more barrels, they represented a philosophy of overwhelming force. A short burst could shred an aircraft, ignite a fuel truck, or destroy a tank's vulnerable rear armor. Luftwaffe pilots accustomed to dueling against lighter-armed fighters were shocked by the sheer density of fire a Jug could unleash. One veteran later admitted, "We thought it was slow, but when it fired, there was nothing slow about it. It filled the sky with death." American commanders, too, made miscalculations. Early in its service, the Jug was criticized for its short range. Bomber groups flying deep into Germany at Regensburg or Schweinfurt paid dearly when the Thunderbolts had to turn back. Losses were so high that some questioned whether the aircraft had a future. It was only after external drop tanks were introduced that the P-47's true potential as an escort was realized. Had the program been cancelled in 1943, as some suggested, history might remember the Jug only as a failed experiment. Another Allied misjudgment was cultural. Fighter pilots idolized agility. They wanted the thrill of dogfights, the romance of victory in swirling duels above the clouds. The P-47 offered something less glamorous: brute survival and destructive efficiency. Many young aviators resisted it, preferring the Mustang's elegance or the Spitfire's flair. Only with time, and hard combat experience, did they come to appreciate that surviving to fly another day mattered more than elegance. These misjudgments reveal a broader truth: war does not reward appearances or expectations. The Germans laughed at the Jug because it looked absurd. The Americans doubted it because it lacked glamour. Both missed the essence of its design. The Thunderbolt was not meant to dazzle, it was meant to endure and to destroy. Numbers bear out the correction of these errors. By war's end, P-47s had destroyed more than 150,000 ground targets and nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft in the air. Its kill ratio against the Luftwaffe was among the highest of any Allied fighter. And yet, even with this record, the Jug never achieved the same mythic status as the Mustang or the Spitfire. Why? Because the earlier misjudgments cast a long shadow. Historians, too, often gravitated toward the sleek and the romantic. The Jug remained the workhorse, respected, but rarely lionized. The irony is sharp. German pilots in 1943, seeing the Jug for the first time, laughed at its size. By 1945, they dreaded it more than the fortress it was built to protect. American commanders, skeptical of its range and agility, nearly sidelined it. By the end, they relied on it as their most effective tactical air weapon. In both cases, initial impressions blinded decision-makers to reality. The P-47 story is not just one of firepower and survivability, it is a lesson in the dangers of underestimation. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the P-47 Thunderbolt had carved out a combat record that few aircraft could match. More than 546,000 combat sorties, 86,000 railway cars destroyed, thousands of tanks and vehicles obliterated, and nearly 4,000 enemy aircraft claimed in the air. Its contribution was undeniable. Yet the consequences of the Thunderbolt service extended far beyond the tally of wreckage it left behind. The first consequence was doctrinal. Before the Thunderbolt, fighter aircraft were often seen primarily as tools of air superiority. Fast, agile, and designed to defeat other fighters. The Jug demonstrated that fighters could be more than dueling machines, they could be hammers of tactical destruction. In Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Rhine, it showed that air power could shape ground battles directly, paralyzing enemy logistics and shielding infantry. The modern doctrine of close air support, later perfected by aircraft like the A-10 Thunderbolt II, traced its lineage back to the Jug. It was no coincidence that the U.S. Air Force named its ultimate tank killer after it. Second, the Jug influenced design philosophy. Its massive radial engine, robust airframe, and sheer survivability challenged the belief that fighters had to be sleek and fragile. Engineers studying its performance recognized the value of redundancy, armor protection, and heavy firepower. While post-war jets prioritized speed, many carried echoes of the Jug's philosophy: build machines that could withstand punishment and deliver overwhelming strikes. The F-84 Thunderjet and the F-105 Thunderchief both inherited aspects of this lineage, favoring power and payload over delicacy. Third, the Thunderbolt left a psychological impact. For American pilots, it was a machine that could be trusted, even loved. Veterans remembered it not as glamorous but as loyal. They told stories of limping home with engines crippled, of wings riddled with holes, of surviving missions that should have ended in death. The Jug became a symbol of resilience, a partner that demanded respect but offered survival in return. For German soldiers and civilians, the memory was darker. Survivors of strafing runs described the sky erupting with tracers, the ground exploding under rockets, and the terror of being hunted relentlessly. The Jug was not elegant, but it was unforgettable. The consequences were also strategic. By crippling German logistics, the Thunderbolt accelerated the collapse of the Reich. Tanks without fuel, trains without rails, and convoys turned to ash meant that German armies were left immobile. Historians debate whether strategic bombing of cities or tactical bombing of infrastructure had a greater impact on Germany's defeat. The Jug's record strongly suggests that tactical destruction, bridges, roads, railways, was decisive. After the war, however, the Thunderbolt's legacy faced an irony. Despite its unmatched record as a ground attack fighter, it faded from the spotlight. The P-51 Mustang, with its sleek lines and role as long-range escort, captured the public imagination. The Spitfire became immortal as Britain's defender in the Battle of Britain. The Jug, by contrast, was remembered mostly by the men who flew it and the enemies who feared it. Its bulk, once mocked, perhaps made it less photogenic. Its role, often close to the mud and blood of ground combat, lacked the glamour of high-altitude duels. Yet, in professional circles, the lessons endured. Air forces worldwide studied the P-47's effectiveness as a tactical fighter bomber. In Korea and later Vietnam, the U.S. relied on similar concepts, aircraft designed not just to sweep the skies but to grind enemy forces on the ground. The eventual creation of the A-10 Thunderbolt II was both homage and continuation. Built around a massive cannon and armored like a flying tank, it embodied the same principles that had made the Jug feared in Europe. The long-term cultural impact is subtler but no less important. For the men of the greatest generation, the Jug symbolized American industrial might. It was big, heavy, loud, and powerful, like the country that built it. Pilots nicknamed it the Jug, not just because of its shape, but because it felt like something solid, something that would never break. In a war where survival was never guaranteed, that mattered. But the Jug also carries a lesson about perception and memory. German pilots laughed at it, American commanders doubted it, and historians often overlooked it. Yet in the end, it was one of the most effective fighters of the war. Its story warns us that history does not always honor the workhorses, even when they carried victory on their backs. For modern audiences, the Jug's long-term impact lies in recognition. To understand World War II fully, one must look not only at the glamorous aircraft but also at the rugged ones that did the dirty work. The P-47 reminds us that war is won not by elegance but by endurance, not by myths but by results. One veteran perhaps put it best when he said, "The Mustang was beautiful, the Spitfire was graceful, but the Jug was our friend. She scared us, she punished us, but she always brought us home." That, more than any statistic, is the Thunderbolt's enduring legacy. The P-47 Thunderbolt story is not one of elegance or beauty. It is a story of grit, resilience, and brute strength. At the start of its career, it was mocked by German pilots and doubted by its own allies. Too heavy, too slow, too ungainly, critics dismissed it before it had even proven itself. But history has a way of humbling arrogance. By war's end, the Jug had transformed ridicule into fear. It had proven that survivability could matter more than grace, that firepower could matter more than finesse, and that the ability to endure could shape battles as decisively as speed or agility. German pilots who once laughed at its size came to dread the roar of its guns. American infantry who once scoffed at its bulk came to scrawl, "Thank God for the Jugs," on walls and helmets. The first lesson is simple: never underestimate. Appearances can deceive, and in war, underestimation is deadly. The Germans dismissed the Jug because it did not fit their idea of a fighter. They paid for that mistake with burning convoys and shattered panzers. The second lesson is about adaptation. Early P-47 units struggled. Range limitations, awkward handling, and a lack of doctrine left the Jug underused. But with dropped tanks, tactical refinements, and hard-won experience, the aircraft's strengths became undeniable. Victory came not from perfection at the start, but from the willingness to evolve. The third lesson is endurance. The Jug was a survivor, armored, rugged, and built to bring its pilots home. In a war of attrition, that mattered more than glamour. Pilots learned to trust it, even love it. Many credited the aircraft with saving their lives, carrying them back from missions that should have ended in flames. These lessons extend beyond aviation. They speak to how we judge, how we adapt, and how we endure in the face of challenge. The Jug reminds us that strength is often unglamorous, that resilience can be more powerful than elegance, and that persistence can turn a liability into a weapon. And so we arrive at the final truth. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not the most famous fighter of World War II. It did not have the Mustang's elegance, nor the Spitfire's romance. But it was the hammer that smashed the Reich's armor, the shield that guarded Allied bombers, and the thunder that rolled across Europe until silence fell in May 1945. If this story has carried you into those skies, if you could hear the roar of the R-2800 engine, feel the rattle of 8.50 caliber guns, and see the burning convoys below, then join us for more. This channel is dedicated to bringing back the forgotten machines and the untold stories that shaped history. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next journey. Like this video to help others discover it. Share it with friends who need to know that history is not just about myths and legends, but also about the workhorses that carried victory on their backs. The Jug's lesson is eternal: strength without glamour, firepower without elegance, survival without apology. That was its greatest weapon. And that is why, even decades later, its thunder still echoes.